let me start off again as economists. So we do recognize collective action, when you said, is really at the heart of a lot of this, and yet you actually went on to say, and Ajay, you reiterated, that there are technology solutions, there are certain policy solutions, and as we have seen, maybe what governments require are certain external commitment devices. For instance, we have seen with the SDGs, or with the MDGs in the past version, that when countries did agree to certain minimum standards, whether it was in healthcare, so maternal mortality, infant mortality, and so on, they did make an attempt, and many countries actually were able to move the policy needle and actually have an impact. Now, what is happening in terms of the environmental policies? One is the local solutions that we talked about, and I think we are largely in agreement that many things can be done. Perhaps experimentation has started in India. But at a global level, first of all, is the research community, is there some kind of a consensus, or do we have, particularly now with Mr. Trump coming in, is there some broad consensus? Are we moving towards certain SDGs? The Paris meet, for instance, are there some common minimum goals that countries have decided upon as far as climate change is concerned? Or is it really starting from scratch?
What the Paris Agreement did was two things. One, it established a regime in which each country has to say what it can and will do. This is important because the previous regime, which was based on a top-down goal model, spectacularly failed. Countries walked out when they found that they couldn't meet their targets. But to make this successful is the second part of the Paris Agreement, which is the transparency requirements, that each country also periodically reports on what it is doing and what are the impacts of its actions. What this does is that it moves the debate from the international negotiations in the UNFCCC to national debates, the polity. Are we happy at the rate at which action is being taken in India? Now, as far as India is concerned, what we have said is that by 2030, we will make sure that while our energy use will increase, given the very low amount of the low quality of life, but each unit of energy used would be used more and more efficiently. And therefore, the carbon dioxide emissions per unit of GDP would be 33 to 35% less in 2030 than what they were in 2005. We also committed that at least 40% of the generating capacity in this country would be non-fossil fuels. We also said that 2.5 billion tons of carbon dioxide would be sequestered because of tree and forest cover. Now, those are ambitious targets. And I think what is important is that each one of us as citizens make sure that we keep the country on track to deliver on those targets.
Thank you. Som, specifically to you, throughout your presentation, I was constantly reminded of what ASR has been able to achieve in education, is to politicize the concern of education. Quality of education has now entered mainstream political narrative, which healthcare hasn't, and clearly environment has not yet. But you do see that by liberating data or giving access to more data to scholars, researchers like yourself, it's possible to cultivate that kind of a narrative and make environment concerns a part of the mainstream political discourse?
Yes, actually I went to the ASR release, which was, I think, day before yesterday, and I'm not sure that that's really the fortunate example, because it's a bit depressing, right? That the first ASR report was released, I think it was 2004 or maybe 5, and now it's 2017, and basically, as somebody said, somebody told Rukmini, who's the head of Pratham running this show, that why do you bother going out and collecting the data from 700,000 children again and again every year? Just publish last year's report, it never changes. and it's true, actually. What is kind of dismaying is that in these 12 years or something, that there's been basically negligible progress at the country level. I mean, a few states this time seem to have got better, but if you look at the numbers, they've got better by about 2 or 3% more children can, in standard 5 can read a standard 3 text, or whatever those criteria are. So in a way, I mean, I'm not sure that that's a great, you might point to that and be quite skeptical and say, what good is transparency, what good is data? These people have been doing this for 12 years, and what's the impact? I have to say it's hard, right? But I think that it is starting to have an impact. There are policy has started to react to this. We haven't yet seen the results, but definitely, at least in some states, the administrations, the governments, the politicians, the civil servants, they have taken this on board. They have come to recognize it. It has become part of the debate, and it has started to change the way at least people are trying to do things, at least in some states. And so I'm hopeful that that process actually will carry on and things actually will get better. But yeah, I mean, I have to say there are no magic bullets. When I call for more awareness, I think that's essential. But of course, it's not a guarantee that we're going to succeed. We're still a very poor country. We have lots of other problems, and people have many other things to worry about. So it's really not easy to make progress on a problem which is so invisible, in the sense it is very damaging, but it's very invisible.
But for the sheer experimentation and the spirit of experimentation, you would support the whole idea of trying out an odd even, which seemed impossible a few years back, but now there's such widespread support for this kind of public action. But obviously we need more of it, and we need data to prove whether it's worked and to what extent.
I have to say that, I mean, for odd even, I have to say that no, I don't think it's a good idea. Yeah. And the reason I don't think it's a good idea is because it's been studied. It's been done in many places, it's been well studied, and what we have learned from those studies is that it doesn't actually work. And the reason it doesn't work is pretty clear, right? I mean, if you just do an experiment for 2 weeks, that's fine. But if this is going to be a long-term policy, then I'm not going to sell my car when it gets old. I'm going to keep it because then I can drive it. And now the fact that I don't sell that old car is that old car is much more polluting than what I would have driven, right, if you hadn't put the policy into place. And this is exactly what was seen in Mexico City. There's very clear studies that have been made, many published papers, not only in Mexico City, but in other places. So it's actually something that has been shown not to work. On the other hand, congestion pricing is a completely different story because it gives the right incentives. So I have to say that, yeah, I mean, experimentation. Let me say that when I call for experimentation, there is a danger here, right? The danger is that suppose government puts in a policy and tells everybody that, look, if you put me, give me a particular plan and you have it approved by this committee, then we'll give you so much budget to run your experiment. Well, people are going to go haywire then, right? Because there's a lot of opportunity for corruption and all kinds of malfeasance. So yes, I'm not saying this is a panacea. So there have to be some kind of checks and balances. You have to produce a plan. You have to show some prior kind of, thing to say, look, why is this reasonable experiment? And experiments are expensive. So before you do an experiment, you should have some reason to believe that this is going to work, that it has a reasonable chance of working.
Absolutely.
Excellent. And I think in the odd even case, the evidence points in the opposite direction.
I mean, this was a case where, as Prof. Somanathan pointed out, it had not worked in Beijing, it had not worked in Lagos, it had not worked in Mexico. And you can keep on, and so therefore just the idea of doing it here and somehow stretching the imagination to believe that it would work here was a bit much. So odd even should reduce the number of cars on the road by 50%. In odd even one, it reduced it by 21%. But by the time you got to the second one, there was even a lower impact and it reduced it by 17%. As far as emissions, as far as pollution is concerned, we actually could not find an impact. We ran models, we collected the data, zero impact.
That's actually consistent with some of our own internal studies at Brookings using the pollution data in the city. Now I'll open it out to the audience. Please identify yourself and keep it limited to one sentence question, please. Yes, sir.
So I think your points about transparency and awareness are I think you can hear my voice, are correct so far as it goes, but it doesn't reach what you need to get. What you need is the next step, which is outrage. When you have public outrage, you have action. If people cared about pollution like they cared about bullfighting in Tamil Nadu, the problem would be solved in a week.
Absolutely.
Well, that's a comment. Thank you for that. Daljit?
So, we see on so many areas that we, the way the government works, we sort of lurch from crisis to crisis. And you notice this with the air pollution. Only when it got really bad was there some response. And some of this happens because it's the media that gets the issue on the agenda. And the media responds to emergency, to crisis. Is there a way, the trouble with doing things in a crisis mode is you don't get the right response. Like to this odd even scheme, they didn't have time to study it. They didn't look at alternatives, all that stuff. So what can we do to make, to sort of do this in a more rational way, a more deliberate way? And can the research community, see, one of the things I think is the research community doesn't put enough pressure on the government, and maybe because our research community is not strong enough. But do you have other ideas about how we could do this in a more deliberate fashion?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really good question. And
He's basically saying, what more can you do, Som?
Yeah, well, I can do more research, but
Yeah.
I should do more research. But no, but seriously, I mean, I think it's really a difficult question, right? I mean, I think the way our governance is really, it's in a difficult position, because if you look at civil servants, I mean, not that I am ever been in the civil service or anything, but I do know people and I have friends in the civil service and so on, and it is. It's difficult because, people are, the demands on the time are to deal with stuff which is really, kind of the burning issue right now, right? Respond to this. And it seems as if people are, at least people in positions of substantive responsibility, they're always firefighting, right? There's a fire here, and then everything is on that fire. And then the moment that dies down, there's another fire somewhere else, and everything is in that. It's, what can I say? I think that, as I said, I think you do need to build, you need some kind of steady sources of funding. At least let me confine myself to the environmental regulation issue. You need a steady source of funding, and so you need a large staff. Once you have a much larger staff, then you have some people, the guy at the top may still be firefighting, this crisis, that crisis. But then there will be a large staff, right, of people who have the time to sit and think and plan. Right, and then present those plans to the superiors and say, look, here's what we can do. And so things can just happen in a kind of automated way, in a much more reasonable framework. And because air pollution is such a complicated and long-term issue, and of course climate change even more so, that you do need that long-term planning. You do need to put these things into place. And also I think that I fully agree with what Dr. Mathur said, that look, they've got to be business models for companies to be able to be part of the solution to implement things. And you can't really get the private sector to do things in crisis mode. It doesn't work, right? Private sector has to make investments. And making investments means planning for a few years ahead, and what you need to do is what policy needs to do is to be fairly stable, fairly predictable, but at the same time giving a clear direction, right? We are going to tighten these regulations. And the reason we're going to tighten them is because we perceive these problems that are being created by this. Therefore, these are the standards that we're going to lay down, and we're going to face them in this manner. If you do it in that way, and if you had the staff and you had the funding so that you could hire the staff to be able to do this planning, then the private sector would jump in and make the right investments, right? Because they have a predictable market to head towards. They get a market signal, no, don't invest more in big diesel SUVs. Yes, do invest in this, cleaner technology. They will do it. Right? How do we get there? I think, as I said, the only way to get there is somehow you have to stabilize the funding for the regulators, give a large predictable source of funding. And then they can hire staff who are not under this extreme time pressure that tomorrow I have to get this done.
Dalit, I think there is a fundamental difference between incremental policy and policy that is large-scale change. Large-scale change only occurs after a catastrophic event. Look at LA, look at London. No matter where, air pollution came to the fore in public policy only after catastrophic events. This implies, but this also implies that as we go along in time, the institutional structures, the funding structures that Professor Somanathan talked about need to be set in place so that then you can keep on making it tighter. So we may be unhappy that it took a very long time for the BS6 to come in, but it has happened. It took a very long time for the environmental emission norms for the thermal power plants to be made so much more stringent, but it happened. So I think these are two different kinds of policy interventions that we need to look into.
Thank you. Anubhav?
Yeah. So if I take away from your talk today, the two takeaways I see. One is more funding, and two is more capacity of, in terms of human resources. India is a very poor country, which is short both of funds and actually even shorter in terms of capacity of people who can do the sorts of things that you want. And I cannot think of any successful experience in that regard in the public sector in India and even in the private sector. So now, obviously, they need to prioritize or have some. What would be your decision rule or process? I could ask you simply, what would be your priorities action? 1, 2, 3 out of the 20 that you could do. Where would you start? Alternatively, if you could just say, how would you go about prioritizing? What should they do? Where should they focus on? And why should they do it?
Well, I guess you mean prioritizing within the environmental regulation sector.
Not a guns versus butter.
No.
Yeah.
But you have mentioned gray, green, brown, as well as all of those 4 typical categories. You can take one of them or take 4 of them. How would you go about take air pollution? You don't think they should do, or even you don't think, what should they do and why should they do it and what priority?
Well, okay. So first, let me just begin with a disclaimer. Look, I'm not an engineer. I'm not an expert. So I'm really the wrong person to ask a technical question as to what exactly should be done. So my point is that there has to be a technical basis on which these decisions are made. They shouldn't be arbitrary, right? And in order to make those decisions on a technical basis, the government needs a sufficiently qualified internal staff. It also needs, as I said, sufficient transparency that it can bring in the expertise of people sitting outside the government, right? Professors or companies or engineers or whoever, consultants, right? There is a whole bunch of people out there who have expertise in particular domains. But if the government continues to operate in the quite opaque way in which it typically operates, then it's hard to bring those people in, right? It's hard to, so that's, I think that, I really don't want to get, I don't think that I can say here that it should be, you should focus on oil refineries or you should focus on coal plants.
A decision rule of deciding where is the biggest bang for the buck.
Well,
we always complain about government not knowing what to do. How should the government decide where is the biggest bang for the buck?
Well, it has to commission certain studies to do a cost benefit of the multiple empirical. Yes.
Let me just, I can just say very quickly, right? One thing that you can say is that in any sector there is a distribution, right? And like what I mentioned with the vehicles is that in the case of emissions from vehicles, that distribution is typically in Western countries has been found to be something like log normally distributed, which means that there is a long right tail, right? And you can take advantage of the fact there's a long right tail. You cut off the end of that tail. You're having to pay up or compensate only a small number of vehicles compensate for a small number of vehicles, but you can have a substantial impact on pollution. I think the same thing was probably going to be true in the power sector. That is to say that if you look at the heterogeneity of actually power plants, you'll find that there are some of them which are really much more polluting than the others. And if this study was done, then that would be an economical thing to do. You can say that, look, there are just 3 or 4 plants which are producing a huge amount of pollution. Let's just shut them down or retrofit them or whatever is the most. So yeah, I think there are a few things like that that would have an immediate impact, and then that can build support for more action.
Ajay, since you had Terry, and at Terry there is a lot of body of work. You've been working on several of these kind of questions. Do you want to quickly maybe respond to that? Are there certain low-hanging fruits that you'd want to suggest right away?
Well, as far as in urban air quality is concerned, I think the 2 large steps that have already been taken are moving to BS6 by 2020 and the environmental emission norm for power stations. That has happened. There are 2 other things which need to be done. One is a business model that gets the biomass, the rice residue to be used or not burnt, whatever it is. So that's clearly the number 1 thing which needs to be done. The second thing that needs to be done is to address the construction and masonry dust that is produced in the cities, which implies therefore that construction norms will have to be done. Thankfully, the number of construction sites which release this dust is not that large, and therefore this is something that can be regulated. And again, having a public system through which people can report, it's also much more easily implementable than many other things. You do these, urban quality becomes much better.
Thank you. This will be the last question, and then I'd recommend, because we really have run out of time, they will be around for a little while, over coffee. You're welcome to have further
Extending the
discussions.
point which professors made about capacity to enforce regulations and monitor, I would like to add one more dimension, that capacity to invest or use the funds. I'll give you 2 examples. One is that close to 50,000 crore of rupees is lying in the corpus towards compensatory afforestation. Now, because that fund is there with states or government of India, and because of the procedural issues, it's not being used for the purpose for which it has been created. Now, 2.5 billion tons of carbon sink is there. Now, how to use that money? Second is that this carbon cess, which also amounts to close to 50,000 crore rupees, which has been collected over last 5-6 years. So if you take these 2 examples, do you think that it's time to move that expenditure and use it in a way rather than building capacity in the public space and using it in some other innovative way so that it actually goes into the areas for which it is collected? That will also give you credibility in terms of when you say polluter pays principle, how it is getting affected in terms of on-ground realities.
Yeah, well, about the Campa fund, actually, some years ago, when Mr. Jairam Ramesh was the minister, I actually wrote to him about that Campa fund, and I suggested that he appoint a group that would actually put in a management information system to sort of verify that the afforestation that the Campa fund was supposed to do, the compensatory afforestation, was actually happening, and that it be monitored. And he was very responsive. He actually set up a committee of which I and some people I know who have expertise in this domain were members. And the idea was basically that you build a simple information system that every state government, right down to the bottom level, can easily enter data, and that it would all be geo-referenced, so it would be easily trackable with satellite images, as a check. But of course, there would also be ground level data entered and so on. But at the end of the day, it just didn't happen. There was apparently too much resistance within the ministry. There were about 4 outsiders on this committee and about 12 people from within the ministry and so on. And at the end of the day, basically nothing happened. I mean, it just died. So, there are things that could be done with these kinds of things, but I didn't talk about one of the elephants in the room, which is corruption, right? I mean, that's one of the things that makes it difficult to do, and in the forestry sector in particular is very corrupt. Let's be clear about that. That's one of the issues. In fact, one reason that we don't know why afforestation, we don't know we've had afforestation programs in India for 60 years, at least, if not longer than that, right? What do we know? What do we know about those afforestation programs? Do we have any data to say what are the results and the outcomes, right? And the answer basically I can tell you is no, we don't know, right? We've spent thousands and thousands of crores over the decades on afforestation programs, right? And basically every 5 or 10 years there's a new one, right? And it has a new name, okay? But essentially we know nothing. So that's where we need somehow to bring in the transparency, but I think in this particular domain it's difficult, and the reason it's difficult is that there's a whole system there which is sitting there to take this money and divert it.
Do you really want to end on that pessimistic note?
I have a spiritual question.
You have a?
Spiritual question about awareness. He talked about that.
Yes.
I really like that because I just want to know, I'm sure you know that Swami Vivekananda said, you cannot bring change in others until you bring in the change in yourself. So when you're talking about awareness, a simple thing like planting a tree, how many of us grow a tree in a single life? So I just want to know from your expertise that how we can bring real and pragmatic awareness in India.
If I may. Sir, I think a lot of what Som presented was about exactly trying to do that in order to create a movement or collective action towards some of these things. Now, I'm speaking on behalf of the scientific community, if I may. Delhi is one of the greenest capitals in the world. I don't think it's paucity of trees because of which the lungs are the way he showed. It will take more than planting trees. And I think there are solutions, that both of you spoke about. But I'd like to end on a high note, not very high. But I think we are at a stage of experimentation again. There is a sense of openness to new ideas. And some of your, older ideas and existing ideas, so I think we have to find ways of sort of channeling them back into the government. Because though Environment Ministry is overwhelmingly caught up with the ease of doing business and not being seen as an impediment in today's day and age. But I think all of these concerns that you're talking about, people are far more aware today than they have ever been. I think at least in terms of urban India. So, this is the right time to be talking about it and possibly move the policy needle, the best that we as researchers can. Thank you all for your time.